this video, we're going to be talking about our introduction to Illustrator notes. Adobe Illustrator is another Adobe product, so we're going to see a lot of similarities between Photoshop and Illustrator when it comes to the setup and organization and layout of the actual software environment. However, they are used for two completely different things. The first thing in our notes, what I'm asking for is the type of software, and why we use Adobe Illustrator is because it's a image design and generation software. So we're going to be designing images and we're going to be generating them for typically some sort of printed source. So it's an image design and generation software. And what that software allows us to create is what we call vector images. And vector images are based on mathematical calculations. So what that means is if I come into Illustrator and I use my zoom tool, we were working with raster imaging in Photoshop, but if I zoom in like I would in Photoshop, notice how you don't see any pixels, all right? They're just sharp, crisp, straight lines. And that is what a vector image is different from a raster image based on. Vector imaging do not have pixels, and they're based on mathematical calculations. So it's basically like a big grid system, X and Y coordinates. Sometimes when we get into 3D stuff in Illustrator, we'll have that Z coordinate. But that's why you have all of those crisp and straight lines. It's because we're working with vector imaging instead of raster images. So we're working with mathematical calculations. So that's what a vector image is. So today what I'll do is I'll kind of toggle between our notes so that you can kind of see where we're at in our notes while we follow along. So the first two questions should already be answered. The next section is very similar to what we saw in our intro to Photoshop notes. It's the screenshot of the environment with numbers 1 through 15 is right here. 1 through 15 that need to be identified. Most of these we should be able to identify based on what we already know about the environment, thanks to Photoshop. So number 1 at the very top, this long gray bar where it says File and Edit and Object, that's called our menu bar, just like in Photoshop. Number 2 right here is pointing to this gray strip here, which is right up top here or right along the left edge of your image window. These are your rulers. How you find your rulers in Illustrator is by going to your menu bar, selecting View, all the way down to Rulers, and then my rulers are on now, so it says Hide Rulers. If I didn't have my rulers on, it would say Show Rulers. The shortcut for those of you who like it is Control R. Notice that we have the tabs up at the top, just like we did in Photoshop. So every time we open up a new file, we will always have it open up in a new tab. But like Photoshop, you can take that tab, you can break it off, and it'll come up into an image window. And my image window is just really big right now, so you can go ahead and make that smaller and kind of customize your image window like you can in Photoshop, and you can do Control-0 to fit to screen. So that'll fit your image, whatever you're working on in your artboard, to the screen, and then Control- will let you zoom just like you would in your Navigator palette or in the bottom left-hand corner of your image window. All right, so that's how I'm doing all that. If you want to put your image window back up, again, just look for that big blue box, throw your tab up top, and it will eventually pop back into place. So that is the rulers and how you find that. I'm using my Navigator palette to kind of inch me around instead of using the arrow keys. Number three. Number three is pointing to kind of this black outline around my Choose Happy design. The black outline is what we call the art board. So in Photoshop, it was called the canvas. Now we're working on artwork, so it's called the art board. Number three, I'm sorry. Number three is the art board. And again, you can kind of see that black outline right here, all the way around. That is the artboard. You can use the artboard tool and adjust how big or small your artboard is if need be. But that is the artboard tool. Sometimes we don't make our documents quite the same size that we need or what we had hoped. So sometimes having access to that artboard tool is very helpful. Number four is your tool palette. Your tool palette. So like Photoshop, you can grab this gray bar up top. You can pull it down. You can rearrange where it's at. These double arrows up top will allow you to make it a single or a double. I'm going to keep mine a double just to keep it a little bit more condensed. If you want to make sure you don't accidentally close out of it, you can hover over on the left side. You'll get that blue bar, and then it'll snap into place, or you can free rotate and move that around your environment. Remember, it's your environment, so set it up however you'd like. All right, next 5 through 11, 5 through 12 and 13, 5 through 13, we have all of these different palettes. So again, like Photoshop, the palette name is going to be in the tab name. So number 5 is going to be our Pathfinder palette. Number 6, I don't have active right now, but I will show you in Illustrator. Number 6 is right here. This is our swatches palette. So it has a bunch of pre-stored swatches, which is really nice. You'll also notice rows of folders. And what you can do is you can create a new color group. So for some of our projects and assignments, it might be nice to create a new color group, and then whatever colors you need, you can kind of drag down into that new color group. And then and then you're just using like those colors for that specific assignment. Some of you like to organize yourself like that, but that is number 6, the swatches palette. Right next to the swatches palette, tab-wise for me, is the color palette. Notice we're working in CMYK. Typically, when we're designing in Illustrator, we design for print, which is our 4 color process: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So nice little review from our CMYK color scheme or color model. You're going to notice these 2 boxes here, which are also here. We'll get to those. Those are 14 and 15 on our list. There's multiple ways to go ahead and change our colors. Number 8 is our character palette. Our character palette has these double arrows, just like our color palette and our gradient palette and our align and our stroke, to the left of the tab name. These double arrows, if you click on them, will condense or expand your palettes. So if you see those, you know that there's more things hiding per se. And if you keep clicking on them or double click on the tab name, it'll go ahead and condense and expand. So that's the character palette. Number 9 is right below the character palette in my environment. You'll need to pull all of these up in your environment, and that is the align palette. This will help us create things that are horizontally aligned and vertically aligned and evenly distributed and stuff like that. So that align palette. Eventually what I'll do is I'll probably lock that in with the Pathfinder palette just to clean up my workspace a little bit. But for right now, while we're learning, I am going to go ahead and break those 2 off separately just so it's easier for learning purposes. Number 10 is the gradient palette. So we'll go over how to create different types of gradients. We have linear gradients, radial gradients, and then a freeform gradient. We can create different gradients by dragging colors into our gradient slider window and creating different gradients that way. So I can grab, oops, that's not a shape tool. I can grab a shape tool, and whatever gradient I have active will show up in my what we call fill color. And then by using my gradient tool, my slider will pop up and I can adjust my gradient here, or I can adjust my gradient in the little slider. Maybe I would want a little bit more heavy black. And then with my gradient tool, I could also change the direction by clicking and dragging on whatever object is active. So that is the gradient tool and the gradient palette. Right below that is our layers. Our layers is number 11 on our note sheet. Our layers work very similar to what we experienced in Photoshop, but the nice thing about our layers in Illustrator is that you don't have to create a new layer for each individual item, which is super nice. We can still hide our layers. In Illustrator, sometimes we need to lock our layers just because we're going to be working with a lot of things. So that's why I have that little lock symbol on there. And then we also have this little arrow right next to this kind of color strip. I'll get into the color strip a little bit later and what that means or represents. But this little arrow, if you click on that, it'll show you what we call sublayers. And I have sublayers on layer 1 and on layer 2. So my sublayer on layer 1 is my orange background. So to practice good layer name, I'll double click on the actual layer name. It'll highlight my text, and then I can go ahead and name my layer. Now it doesn't look like there's anything on layer 1 when I hide the orange layer because my text and my smile are white like my artboard color. But if I hide my group down here, like this is my smile, so I could rename that if I wanted to. This is a small little thing, so naming my sublayers is not an issue. Will you always name your sublayers? Absolutely not. That's my typeface so that I remember what typeface I used here. And then we have these things called guidelines. I have mine hidden right now. But I have a note at the bottom of page 1, I believe, called guidelines. And guidelines do not print, but like in Photoshop, they help us guide whether for be, a specific measurement or a specific placement or a specific size of something. Those guidelines are super helpful. How you find those is if you go up to view guides. You can hide your guides. Here's the shortcut that I did was control semicolon. In Illustrator, typically they are locked, which means once you place a guide, they don't move. So if you want it to move, you can unlock your guides. If you're done with your guides and you don't need them anymore, you can just press clear guides and they'll go away. Notice how they also disappeared from my sublayer. So as you go ahead and create things, like I'm on layer 1, I have layer 1 active because of that blue bar. But if I create, that rectangle again with my gradient, notice how it automatically creates that new sublayer for me. So anything new that I add, Illustrator will automatically add that as a sublayer. All right. Now, if you wanted that on a new layer, you would press the create a new layer button. New layer would pop up, and I can actually take my sublayer. Notice this is a target. Anytime that target is active, I can click on that little circle. Whatever sublayer that is, it'll activate that sublayer or item in your drawing or on your artboard. So what I can do is I can click and drag maybe those two rectangles to that new layer. And then, if I need to lock it, I can lock it. If I need to hide it so it's out of the way while I'm designing things, I can lock it and hide it. So I'm not making any changes to it. Or I can select that whole layer and I can delete that whole layer because I don't really need it. All right, but that's kind of how the layers palette in Illustrator works. All right, number 12. Number 12 we are used to from Photoshop. Number 12 is our Navigator palette. Notice you're going to still have the zoom in and zoom out mountains. You could also do the zoom options from the drop down. As I get smaller, notice that little red box isn't showing up. I don't know if that's just a my computer thing. Sometimes it shows up for me, sometimes it doesn't. So I don't know if my computer is just glitching or what's going on. But the Navigator palette does allow you to go ahead and preview that area or change the area that you're looking at very quickly still. Number 13 is our stroke palette, and we'll get into what stroke is in a little bit. But this is the stroke palette all the way opened up. Again, it has the up and down arrows to the left of the name. So that means it's expandable or condensable. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and keep that opened up all the way so that we can see all of our options. So that brings us to number 14 and number 15, and those are identified in our tool palette as well as in our color palette. So they will look identical all the time. So right now I have a gradient and what we call the fill color, which is number 14. And that'll also show up in our swatches palette, and that will also show up. My orange is highlighted in my gradient palette, which is why it's orange there. But it should also show up in your color palette as well. So I am going to go ahead and create a new layer, and I am going to throw on a star with a couple points. My arrow keys are sticking a little bit. I apologize. So there's my star. Notice my fill color right now is filling in my object, and whatever color is in your fill color will always fill in the entire object that you have. I can use the color palette. My fill color is active right now because it's in front. The 15 is called your stroke on your notes, and your stroke box is sitting behind your fill box. So the fill is at the active color right now, and the stroke is not, which is why the stroke color is not changing. This is a new feature I am definitely not used to, but apparently when you use a gradient and whatever gradient slider you have active, it will go ahead and have that color active in your gradient. And that's why that color is showing up in our color palette as well. So let's say I wanted just a solid color. Maybe I wanted my star to be like a reddish color. All right, now you can see my red color showing up in my fill color and my gradient. It's also showing up as my fill color in my color palette. And new to Illustrator CC, it'll also show up in your swatches palette. I'm learning so much. All right, so your fill color. Now, if we were just to create like a line with our pen tool, and we'll get into the pen tool a little bit later, but that's what our pen tool does, is it creates paths and objects for us. And I have my fill color in, so it's connecting kind of these dots of my object or my path that I created with my pen tool. So even though it's a path, it's not closed, it will still fill in and kind of connect the dots there. Now, if I swapped those out, now I have my red as my stroke color. Okay, and your stroke color is kind of like the outline of something. And my fill color is this white box with the line through it. And this is what we call none, right? Or transparent or no color. All right, and that is going to be really important for us in a little bit. I can bump up my stroke weight using my stroke palette. My line is still active because I can see these lines here, and notice my stroke weight is getting larger and more obviously prevalent as my stroke weight increases. So you can create something with just a stroke, you can do it with just a fill, or let's say I wanted to add a stroke color to my star. I would need to select it. I can give it a stroke color of blue, You can't really see that because it is so tiny. And there we go. So you can give it a fill or a stroke, whatever you'd like. So we have some options there. But that is what number 14 is. That's your fill color. Number 15 is your stroke color. So those are the 15 things that we're predominantly going to be working with. How you find your palettes is by going to Window and then select the palette that you're looking for, just like in Photoshop. So we're going to go to Window, and then you need to make sure that you have your line, your color, your gradient, layers, navigator, pathfinder, stroke, and then your character is actually hiding. Your character palette, you have to go down to the word type and then up and over to the word character. For those of you like shortcuts, Command T. So pause the video, make sure that you have all of these palettes organized however you would like in your own environment. Once you're done with that, what we'll do next is go over the tool palette, and that will be in video number 2.